Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Christmas edition of Old Scribes, where we have a big gift for our listeners. The Renaissance man of the Southwest, the Midwest, everywhere, Mr. Russ Bradburd, former UTEP coach, former NMSU coach, professor at New Mexico State University, author of 5 books, including his latest called Big Time. Native of Chicago who now lives in Las Cruces. I can relate to that. Coach Bradburd, welcome to the show.
Yes, and I'm retired, by the way, Matt. I retired from teaching in June, so
okay.
That's why
it's hard to keep up.
Yeah, all right.
So tell us a little bit about. Let's jump right into the book. There's been a lot of news stories in recent days and recent weeks, a lot of coverage of it. And it seems to be kind of fitting in today's kind of college football world, especially in light of one Diego Pavia, who got a 6th year of eligibility, it appears, or 5th year. Yeah. So talk a little bit about that. Just, what gave you the idea to kind of start with writing this book? I know you've been at it for a while.
Yeah. I have been. I was at it for a decade, and I just thought I had coached Division I basketball for 14 years at UTEP and New Mexico State. And when I got into the academic side of things, when I quit to become a writer and I was very fortunate to get my professor's job, just sort of the right place at the right time. But I immediately saw how absurd the world was. Not just the crazed emphasis of sports, not so much at New Mexico State, which is pretty much in perspective. Our basketball coach only makes $400,000 a year, but at other places, at Arizona it's $4 million, in Texas it's $4 million. But being on the academic side of things, I saw how strange and weird the whole marriage was of academics, academics and universities sort of sponsoring these sports teams. But I felt like plenty of people have written great books about the ethical problems of this. But to my ear, no one had written a novel, and I thought it was funny. And I just think I've gotten, Matt, where I think Stephen Colbert is a better news source than the New York Times, and I think that Jon Stewart is with his humor can get at things that the Washington Post can't get at. And I think, so I wanted to write a novel, and I wanted to do something funny, and studied funny novels for a long time, and I had a feeling of panic for the first few years, thinking I've got to get this book finished before they clean up college sports and it becomes, it becomes more in perspective on our campuses. And of course, with NIL and Diego Pavia and people like that, it's never going to get in perspective. And I should also say I was all in favor of the players getting compensated, but what I was worried about was that that sports would get put into the proper perspective before my book came out. But now sports are bigger than ever.
I mean, we've seen with Diego going to court and successfully getting the injunction and being able to play next year. The order does not include really anyone else, but of course the floodgates are going to open now, and eligibility and how many years they can play is going to be called into question. I mean, when is this going to end? The portal and NIL has changed the game as far from when the game that was going on when we went to college.
Yeah, I don't know. I think we're in uncharted territory. I don't know what's going to happen. I think college sports in 5 years will look very different than it is today. And of course, today it looks very different than it did 2 years ago. But what I wanted to do with the novel, with Big Time, I don't think we're so far from this happening. The premise of the novel is that Coors gives a university that's in trouble. Maybe it's Colorado State, maybe it's University of Colorado. I never name it, but Coors gives them $1 billion to buy, but they want naming rights, and so the school changes its name to Coors State University, and oh, by the way, Coors insists that all the money goes to football and basketball. So that happens in the first. That happens before the novel ever opens. But I'm not sure, George, how far we are from that. You know, we're naming courts and we're naming usually we're naming the court for Don Haskins or Lou Henson or that kind of thing. But how far are we from naming the courts after T-Mobile or T-Mobile or Starbucks or that kind of thing? I don't think we're so far away from the corporate takeover of the entire universities.
Well, I know, we've seen it now with all the big arenas always have a corporate name to them with a big price tag. And, they switch almost every year. The contract's supposed to be for 25 years, but we've seen them go shorter and shorter. And every school has to have some sort of branding about itself. And that's where the money's got to come from. You could look at an NBA game, and maybe even a lot of the college games, the bigger games, and you see a lot of branding around the court. The court might be named after someone who is living and breathing, but the basketball goal and where the glass is and where the bench is and the chairs and just about everything else has some sort of corporate logo on it nowadays.
Yeah, I think everything is for sale. And, in sort of doing the research to think about the mentality for this book, I didn't know this at the time, but in 1936, the University of Chicago, which is, of course, one of the top academic institutions in the world, they were in the Big Ten Conference. And they played Illinois and Iowa and those. But in 1936, they had the Heisman Trophy winner. The first Heisman Trophy winner played for University of Chicago. It was a guy named Jay Berwanger. 3 years later, the president of the University of Chicago dropped football. No more football. He felt it was corrupting the mission of the university. And so one of the things, the book sort of pokes fun at the encroachment of football and basketball on our campuses. But what it really pokes fun at is how impotent the faculties are. Like, I think what the president, his name was Robert Maynard Hutchins, it was a gutsy thing to do, to drop football when they were in the Big Ten. But who else? I'll wait for you guys to name a college administrator that has that kind of courage. I think college administrators are being run by the athletic department. It's the dog wagging, the tail wagging the dog. Mm-hmm. It's the world turned upside down. And it's one thing when it happens at the bank or at the car dealership, but when it happens at our universities, I think it's really something to take notice of.
Yeah. I think the athletic departments might say that, the football program is funding a lot of, the school initiatives, and the basketball program is ultimately contributing something into the academic department. And so that's the big money maker in the university. And that's why it seems to be more and more resources are being applied to that. But now it's gotten to the point where the idea of going to college to get a degree is fallacy. That's not what people are doing. They're trying to chase the NIL money.
Well, I think that's right. But one of the other things, one of the arguments that sometimes is made, University of Michigan, for example, they're paying their football coach $7 million a year or whatever it is, and but they're still making money at football. They've got a stadium that seats $100,000. But I don't think just because it's making money makes it right for a university. I think that there's plenty of things that we can do that would ethically compromise the university, but would still make money. And the fact that it makes money, that to me, that's not a legitimate argument for a university. But and of course, the truth is that Eastern Michigan, Western Michigan, Central Michigan, they're all losing money trying to do what Michigan and Michigan State are doing. So as you guys, I'm sure that most of the Division I schools are losing money hand over fist.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And it's probably why schools like UTEP and New Mexico State, have such a hard time competing. They just don't have the funds to compete with the schools that have more money.
Yeah. I think my guess is what we're headed to, and I'm not the first person to say this, is that there will be the super conferences, the power conferences, and then there will be everybody else will be doing it. But now that if they're going to make if they're going to let junior college players have their 2 years back, there's going to be a real flood of. It actually makes junior college pretty prestigious in a basketball sense. But at Coors State University, Matt, at Coors State university in the novel. The most of half of the faculty quits, but the other ones have to work at the games in order to survive. So the math department does statistics. Business is doing the investments for the players and coaches for their NIL money. The engineering department is expanding the stadiums. Women's studies is doing the players' laundry. That'll make some people angry. But the heroes of the book, that there's 2 old history professors and a young poet, and they decide we've got to take our university back. But I've gotten where I think that it'll never be taken back. That basketball and football will always trump academics at American universities.
But wouldn't you say that that's always been the case? I mean, even going back when you were at UTEP or at New Mexico State, I mean, it kind of felt like, certainly not to the degree it is today, but it always kind of felt like, they were kind of the big dogs on campus.
Well, I think when it's a winning program, that's true. I remember when I was at UTEP, we were much better than University of Texas. We outdrew we led the state in attendance, and we would, the only time we played Texas, we pounded them.
Yep.
And, so I do think, but I do think now, because money has become the most important issue, schools that don't have the budget that University of Texas or Michigan do will be, money is going to separate everybody now. And I think the days of the sleeper teams and Loyola of Chicago or, the smaller schools, I don't know what will happen to Gonzaga, but I think it's good. I think the glory days for UTEP and New Mexico State they're on thin. I think both of those programs will be on thin ice because they're not going to have the budgets. A couple of years ago, UTEP's best player was a kid named Sule Boom. And of course, it's been a long time since I coached at UTEP, but he led the team in scoring and minutes played. He was on the first train out of town to go to Xavier of Ohio, which, is a good program, but UTEP is at least as good in terms of historical importance as Xavier of Ohio. And I just think the days of the kids staying for 4 years, but by the way, I should also say, I don't blame the kids. I think one of the things I hear fans saying all the time is these kids are so messed up. Like, I bought my daughter a cell phone, an iPhone. And so I can complain about her being on her iPhone all the time, but this is the world that we've handed our kids. And this is the world that the players have been handed. And when the coaches are leaving as soon as they can for more money, why should we blame the players for doing that? But that's not so much. The focus of big time isn't so much the NIL and the players abandoning their teammates for more money. It's more how the faculty has sort of become so impotent and get caught up. I have yet to hear if I was the only one that ever brought up the role of athletics in a faculty meeting. I never heard anyone else ever bring it up. And at one point, the provost came to our English department meeting, and I raised my hand. I didn't even have tenure at the time, and asked him, "Why are we spending $1 million to renovate the Coca-Cola weight room? It's already the nicest weight room we've ever seen." And boy, he turned red, and I could see my colleagues squirming, and 2 of them came up to me afterwards, and they sort of hissed at me and said, "You don't have tenure, and that's not the kind of thing you're supposed to ask the provost about. We're supposed to sort of kiss his ring in some ways." And I just feel like I find the administrators, not on the athletic side, but the academic administrators, I find them to be cowardly, and they won't stand. They're afraid to stand up and say, this has gone too far. And now it's gone so far. And as we know in American politics today, bad behavior can get regularized, where it just becomes the way, and it's normal. It's like gun violence on Chicago's West Side. It's just the way the world is, and we've stopped pushing back. I remember when the Iraq War started 20 years ago or whatever, and people were up in arms about it, but after a while, after 3 or 4 days, people go on about their lives, and I think that it's hard to fight the long fight and to keep pushing back. And I just felt like making fun of it and making people laugh, maybe that could change the narrative a little bit.
It seems like you've gotten, from what I've read and what I've seen, it seems like you've got a pretty good response to it so far.
Well, as they say in Ireland, it is and it isn't. I think people have taken notice. In today's world, it's not just American universities that are doing this. There's hardly any book. George could tell you this. He's a top writer about boxing and that kind of thing. But who does book reviews anymore? The New York Times, the Washington Post. There's very few book reviews anymore. So what I'm trying to do, I'm trying to adapt to the modern world. I'm hoping that someone will tweet about it. I want, like my last book, Steve Kerr tweeted about my last book. And that way, or the subject of my last book, the gun violence survivor named Sean Harrington. I want Beto O'Rourke to tweet about my book. I want Jay Billis to tweet about my book. I want George to tweet about my book. And it's through, the world has changed quite a bit. So yeah, the book is doing well. There hasn't been a book review about it yet, but it got on the new Seth Davis website, and this guy tweeted about it, and that guy. But I'll tell you a funny story. Is the Denver Post? There's University of Colorado is sort of the example of what's happened to college sports with prime time. And I actually like Deion Sanders, and I think he's a visionary in some ways. But they've taken over the entire campus. There's a class on campus now where that's the entire point of the only thing they do in the class is they study Colorado football. And that seems like a weird class to me. But at the University of Colorado, they announced that the Denver Post guy can't ask questions at the press conferences.
Yeah.
And that seems crazy to me. We're not in fourth grade. Like he has to go sit in the corner and not raise his hand and ask questions. But
that's happening in the White House.
Yeah, that's right. But I found that and I'm conflicted about primetime because I wrote the Nolan Richardson biography, and I've seen what happens to black coaches, particularly black coaches who come from historically black colleges, that they never get a chance, and if they do get a chance, they get the worst jobs. And here's Deion Sanders; he's got a pretty good job, and he's running with it. He's doing all he can. So I'm conflicted about it. By the way, George, I will say I'm conflicted about the whole thing in that I'm critical of the system, but I'm the television analyst for New Mexico State home games. I'm like the alcoholic that keeps walking by the bar and saying, "Hey, I think that's Matt in there. Maybe I'll go in and have a beer with Matt." I'm part of the problem. I love college basketball and I love the game, and there's nothing I'd rather do than to go watch the New Mexico State Aggies play. But and again, the New Mexico State's not really who I'm targeting with this. I'm targeting the schools that are paying the coach $5 million a year and that kind of. And it's been true for a long time that the highest paid state employee at every state in America is a football or basketball coach. But pretty soon, it's going to be a quarterback and a point guard and that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's no question about that. I think that's the way where college athletic is headed. And we're already there. And there's not a lot of situations where things go back to where they were. And maybe there'll be some constraints later on down the line as to how many times a kid can transfer from one school to the next. And I'm sure even that'll be challenged in court somewhere down the line. So, who knows how this thing is going to shape out over the next 5 years.
Well, where I suspect we're headed is that it'll be like pro basketball in that, if you look at the Lakers, or I remember when Tim Floyd was the coach of the Chicago Bulls, half the team, more than half the team was making more money than he was. And I think that's what we're headed for is, how important is the coach at University of Illinois if he doesn't have the 7-footer that's the best player in the state? Like the 7-footer is more. It's no secret. I'm not the first one to say that talent is more important than coaching. And you're not. There are no good coaches with bad players. There's no good coaches with bad players. There's only. It's just a matter of talent. And there's fine tuning. And is Bill Self a better coach than Nolan Richardson or that kind of thing? But there is no. For example, I do think Nolan Richardson was able to squeeze the most out of his players, but you gotta have players. There's nobody winning with bad players.
Right.
I mean,
go ahead, George.
Speaking of Nolan Richardson, I mean, that was probably one of my favorite books of all time because he's probably one of my favorite people of all time. When you wrote his biography, it was 40 minutes of hell.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, one of the things I noticed, Nolan was a troublemaker. Like if you were racist or unfair, or and if you weren't going to treat someone fairly, or if you were sexist, he would make trouble for it. And he called out injustice when he saw it, and which is he wasn't doing it on Twitter. He was doing it with his university president and his athletic director, and he really walked the walk. And I mean, he was a trailblazer and really an interesting guy. He grew up a Spanish speaker in the Segundo Barrio in El Paso, and was raised by a woman who was born in 1880, whose parents had been slaves. I mean, he was really the likes of Nolan Richardson will never come around again. But what he did is, I think, in some ways, Nolan Richardson made Deion Sanders possible. It was the John Thompson and John Chaney and Nolan Richardson. They were the guys that were calling out injustice, calling out racism, and they really changed the world and opened the doors for so many. It's like Charles Barkley said, that any African American coach today owes a debt to Nolan Richardson, and I think that's.
Mm-hmm. I remember I actually almost played against one of his Bowie high school teams. I think probably had to be his last year at Bowie before he left to go coach in junior college. But we were still playing football. We made it to the football playoffs. And so the game against when Mayfield played Bowie was early in the year. So I didn't get to play because I didn't join the basketball team until the football season was over. So I never actually got to play against his teams, but saw him when he was at Tulsa. He had all those great teams against Aggies. And then when he went to Arkansas, I was working at the Commercial Appeal at the time. And they heard about this guy who was coming from Tulsa to be the head coach of the Razorbacks, and they were kind of skeptical. He was African-American, going to go coach in the, I don't know whatever conference they were in then. And I remember telling the people at the Commercial Appeal, you're going to have a good coach. And when he came in talking about winning national championships in the plural form, that kind of got their attention.
Yes. He was brash. And I mean, I wonder what University of Arkansas is like now with Walmart. I would imagine is funding a lot of the NIL. Kind of stuff. I imagine that Arkansas has gone through some, you've got Calipari now, and now, it's, I think at one time that there were, schools that were paying players under the table, but now it's all out in the open now, and it's the Wild West. But what I suspect will happen is that if someone gives a lot of money to get a great player and the team doesn't win, boy, that guy's going to be angry. And it used to be if you gave $100,000, a car dealer gave $100,000, some of it went to volleyball and some of it. But now if it's going to a 7-footer or a point guard in the team or a quarterback and the team loses, that's gonna hurt some feelings there.
Yeah, a few.
They want some return on that investment, huh?
Yes. Well, I think people will want. It's always been, what have you done for me lately? But now it's really going to be. It's really, really going to be, what have you done for? I noticed that Doug Gottlieb is getting a lot of heat because his team isn't very good. Well, no one would have cared about that before. Not that no one would have cared about it, but they would have given him a couple of years before they start, criticizing him for not having a winning team in his first 2 months on the job. I don't know. I don't know Doug Gottlieb, but he was in the news for for maybe possibly overlooking Michigan Tech, I guess.
Bulletin board material.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Russ, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about UTEP basketball. You mentioned them. They have not made the tournament, or have not won a tournament game since around the time that you were there. I know the last time they actually appeared was '92, and they were the players that you recruited out of Chicago.
Yeah, there was a lot of luck involved at that time, but they haven't won an NCAA tournament game since 1992, and they've only been in 3 NCAA tournaments since then. But I stumbled on Tim Hardaway. It was just an accident, really. I just thought, well, he looks pretty good, and I've gotten a lot of credit for being a recruiting genius for discovering Tim Hardaway. But I think there was a lot of luck involved, and I mentioned this in the Nolan Richardson book. His high school coach closed up the recruiting of him and let him sign early, even though there wasn't anyone recruiting him, which most coaches wouldn't do that. They would say to a kid, why don't you wait till the spring? But Hardaway signed early with us, and I never really understood why until I wrote the Nolan Richardson book. And his coach, Tim Hardaway's high school coach, was a man named Bob Walters, who I think until very recently had the most touchdowns in Arkansas high school history. and got no offers. Didn't get an offer from the University of Arkansas. He was number one in his class, had scored over 100 touchdowns in high school, and didn't get an offer. But he watched the 1966 championship game when Haskins beat Kentucky. And that stuck in his mind. And when I came around saying, Don Haskins, and we want your excited, he changed the world. And, he's a historically important coach. And I think Bob Walters never told me this, but I now in my heart, I really believe I can honestly tell you, Matt, that I am not a genius. And that Bob Walters, I think it really hit home with Bob Walters that here's Don Haskins after one of my players who changed the world of college basketball, because it made no sense to let Tim Hardaway sign early with us. He visited Western Illinois and UTEP, and that made no sense to let him sign early. He should have waited till the spring, and Illinois would have been after him, DePaul would have been after him, and Michigan State, but he had him sign early. And Tim was a very loyal guy. He's still married to his high school girlfriend. Gives you an indication of. So he came with us and did great, and never thought about transferring, never left, and played 4 years for Don Haskins. But those were really magic. At the time, even then with Don Haskins, I knew what an important person he was historically. And I think even then, looking back at my career, Matt, I don't think I could drop a single Don Haskins play or a Lou Henson play for that matter. But I've got some good stories about those guys. And I think even at that time, I didn't know at the time, but I think basketball was a window into Black culture, which I found very interesting. And I found the stories more interesting than the actual game and the fundamentals and the X's and O's. I wasn't an X and O coach. I think I'm a storyteller. I think I was already a better storyteller probably at the time than I was a coach.
Yeah, your life kind of changed after your New Mexico State years. And you kind of started reading some more and reading even more. And so talk about the transition. I mean, it kind of feels like, it was a change in your life that was you didn't even know how much it was needed at the time, but it was.
No, but I think I was always a closeted reader. On Southwest Airlines, they don't have the assigned seating. So you'll wait. So I learned this. I would deliberately wait, and then I'd get a middle seat away from everybody else, and then I could read my book. Whereas if you weren't reading Sports Illustrated or the scouting report, you would get teased by the players or the coaches. Like, you would get caught up in conversations about whatever. So I always sort of relished airplane time and hotel time. To this day, when I go into a hotel, I don't turn on the television. I get a book out. So I was always sort of a closeted reader. But when I went into Lou Henson to tell him that I was going to quit to get an MFA, get a graduate degree in writing, he said, wait here a minute. And I didn't know this at the time. I knew that Lou Henson's son had died in a tragic car accident. But what I didn't know at the time was that Lou's son was a closeted writer, that he had notebooks full of poems and short stories in his closet. After he died, they were discovered that, as a coach, there is a sort of an anti-intellectual bent, is that oftentimes coaches would discourage academic achievement or discourage reading books. I think a lot of coaches, I was like this as a coach too. Like, for example, with Tim Hardaway, after practice, he would go home and watch games till midnight. Well, I never did that. I don't want to go home. I want other interests, but I don't want players with other interests. I want players that all they do is eat, sleep, and when I remember when we went to Tim Hardaway's home, his mother told us that he had wept. He'd cried after they lost, after the last loss when he was a junior. And I thought, there's the guy we want. We want the guy who's going to cry after the game. We don't want the guy who can laugh and joke after the game. But as for myself, I don't want to compare myself to Phil Jackson or Steve Kerr, but I find those guys more interesting than Bob Knight, like somebody who's, I guess Knight would read history and that kind of thing. But I just felt like I was a better coach if I was well-rounded, if I could talk the talk and had, I think that reading books can inform you. And, I think you can learn a lot about life from reading James Baldwin or John Steinbeck. I don't think I think learning about life from James Baldwin makes you a better coach. It's a weird idea, I know.
Can't hear you, George.
I mean, with the way things are going now, coaches like yourself have always liked to, impact young men beyond the basketball court or the playing field. And sometimes that took time. It took a year, it took 2 years, maybe 3 years of coaching a kid. I mean, we've all kind of seen it, and they blossom like those last 2 years, their junior or senior year, they become starting to reach their full potential. Can that still be achieved the way college athletics is going today with, if a kid doesn't like what's happening at one school, he can go find another coach or school to play for, and you don't really get that time to develop a kid and turn him into a man the way you used to?
I don't think it can, George. And I'll start by saying I watched the Serbian team almost beat us in the Olympics when I was in Ireland this summer, and the Irish coaches I was around were perplexed as to how a team with less talent was. I think it's because it's all become an individual game for us, and that's why Serbia is able to hang in until Steph Curry and LeBron James go into a phone booth and put on their capes and do their Superman routine. I think we've lost that. I think that important things in life, whether it's writing a book or becoming a great dribbler or becoming a writer, those things, or making a guitar, that it takes years and years to become good at something. And I think what we should be teaching kids is sustained attention and loyalty and sustained attention and sustained effort, and hang in there and let's outwork people. But what we're teaching kids now is where's mine? I mean, that might as well be college sports motto. It should say right under the NCAA emblem, it should say "Where's mine?" with a question mark, because I think that's what we've. And I don't blame the kids. I think this is the world we've handed these kids, and I think when the best teams we had at UTEP and New Mexico State were teams that had redshirted a kid, and we've got all these seniors, and Tim Hardaway averaged 5 points a game as a freshman. Yeah, and Antonio Davis averaged 1 point a game as a freshman, then went and played a decade in the NBA. And I think the days of holding on to those kids and teaching them value. If my wife were to get rid of me every time I screwed up, or to walk away every time she was unhappy, I would have been divorced 50 times by now. And I think what we should be teaching young people is sustained effort and sustained attention. And I just don't know what the value of sports are, other than. But I will also say this, though, is you guys probably remember David Megacy, that he wrote the book Out of Their League. He dropped out of pro football in 1970 to work to end the Vietnam War. And he told me fairly recently, he said, it's like the diamond ring that's on your wife's finger, is that the diamond's really beautiful, but behind that diamond ring, there's child labor, there's ruined environments, there's blood, there's murder and that kind of. There's terrible things behind that diamond ring, but the ring is beautiful. I still think of college basketball that way. Is at the end, there's all this selfishness and greed and money, but when you turn the lights on and throw the ball up at midcourt, it's still a beautiful game. I still think it's a great game, and so that's what keeps pulling all of us back. And the other thing I think, George, is I think that we as humans were wired for stories. I don't want to argue about religion, but if I tell you you're going to hell if you don't believe in Jesus, that's not a good story. We need this. It's only through the stories that that things come alive. And I would say that even every college basketball game is a story, and every career is a story. And I think that's what pulls people into when they go watch New Mexico State play UTEP. There's a certain story. There's a drama to that story that we find very compelling. It's why movies are a story and novels are a story. But what we've done now to college sports is we've chopped it up. It's all sort of, aborted stories all the time, is when kids are changing schools every 10 minutes and coaches were doing it first. Let's be honest. It was coaches and it was administrators firing coaches that should have never been fired. And I think that what we've gotten away from is sustained effort and loyalty, and the values that we grew up with are no longer involved in sports.
You hit on something there where, we said this years ago, but there would never be another Don Haskins staying, a great coach staying at one place for 30 something years or whatever. Why do you think he stuck around so long when he had plenty of opportunities and actually left at one point for a day or whatever? But what was it about that job that made him stick around for so long?
Well, I think, I mean, El Paso is not for everybody, but I really love El Paso. It's 80% Hispanic. It's a very soulful place. And it's, it's great weather and mountains, and there's no pro team there. So I think Coach Haskins really loved El Paso, and I think his highest salary was something maybe 180,000. When I got there in 1983, he was making $75,000, and he'd won a national championship, and it changed the world. But he wasn't interested. He had a different value system. I don't think he didn't care that much about money. He was never good with money. I think he gave a lot of money away. He helped people and never invested. I don't think he invested smartly. I don't think he understood the stock market and that kind of thing. But also, I'll also say this, Matt, is if you think about the coaches that have gone to UTEP and done fairly well and left and then fell on their face at their next job, it's virtually everybody. Now, Billy Gillespie did pretty good at Texas A&M, but then fell on his face at Kentucky for a number of reasons. But everyone who has left, come to you, Doc Sadler and Billy Gillespie and I'm forgetting the coach that went to Auburn. He was the first. Help me, George. Anyway, my point is UTEP's a good basketball job, or it was. I don't know if it's a good basketball job now with NIL, but it was a better basketball job than Auburn, and it was a better basketball job in some ways. The UTEP job was a better job than Auburn. It wasn't as much money. And it's the same at New Mexico State. Paul Weir left, Marvin Menzies left, Reggie Theus left, and they've all got fired from their jobs. The New Mexico now, Chris Jans has done pretty well at Mississippi State, but these are good jobs. Even though they're a long way from the players and they're in isolated places, it's beautiful weather, it's mountains, it's the best Mexican food in the world, and it's always been a welcoming culture. When Don Haskins started 5 black players, he was in the old Confederacy doing it, and there's no other town in the old Confederacy that would have let him start 5 black players and not given him hell about it.
Right. I mean, that's and even a lot of the things that Lou Henson was doing back in the day, because I remember the early teams back then. A lot of the players were from Yonkers, New York, and Hartford, Connecticut, and places like that, where he recruited, got Sam Lacey out of, the bowels of Mississippi somewhere. So they were able to get some athletes. There was no Big East back then, Big East Conference, way back in the day. So they were able to get some of those players and some tremendous basketball teams way back in the day like that.
Well, Lou never bragged about it. And many people don't know the story, George, but when he left Las Cruces High School to take the Hardin Simmons job, his demand, unlike the Coors Brewing Company that wanted to rebrand, they insisted his demand, rather than rebrand as Coors State, his demand was that he wanted to recruit their first black players, and he wanted to bring a Mexican-American assistant coach. And I think they probably felt like, anyway, they let him do it at Hardin Simmons, a Baptist school. And so he desegregated Hardin Simmons, and some people think Haskins desegregated UTEP, but that's not true. That Nolan Richardson was already on the team, and so was Willie Brown. Nolan was already the best player on the team, but Lou Henson was, and these were the only coaches, Dean Smith sat at lunch counters, in North Carolina. So it was that kind of era. And I think Henson, both Lou Henson and Don Haskins, I think were on the right side of history in that regard.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Tony Barbie was who we were looking for.
Thank you. Boy, man, I'll walk in the other room and think, what did I come in here for now?
Oh, I know.
I know Tony Barbie, and I have great respect. He did a great job at UTEP, but then, but left UTEP for Auburn and wound up getting fired. And and I think Haskins knew he had a good, I don't want to say he did whatever he wanted, but during the basketball season, he came in for practice. And so he was able to, and other schools, he would have had to go around and schmooze with boosters and that kind of thing. And he was sort of able to do whatever he wanted. And by the way, as you guys well know, sports is often, when Coach Haskins won the championship with the first all-black team to win the all-black starting 5 to win the championship, Texas Western or UTEP, they'd never had a black professor.
Mhm.
So it was the next year that they hired their first black professor, and that story happens over and over again in American sports, where Jackie Robinson desegregates baseball in the modern era, and 2 years later the U.S. military desegregates. And so whether it's Megan Rapinoe or Colin Kaepernick, or David Megacy or John Carlos and Tommy Smith in the 1968 Olympics, it's always sports that's moving the dial and opening doors for people, whether it's gay athletes or athletes of color, particularly in terms of race. But again, Lou Henson and Don Haskins were very much ahead of their time in the early 1960s.
Amen to that. Amen to that. So tell me, I have an idea for a book, but I don't know exactly how to go about it. What's your process when you get an idea and you start to make that journey?
Well, George, as you well know, if you've read my books, I'm not a great writer, but I think I have good ideas for books. And for me, having a good idea for a book, rather than, although even sometimes that can fool you. I think if I went to a publisher and said, I've got an idea, I'm going to go to a small town in Texas and follow their football team for a year, for a high school football team. Well, that's Friday Night Lights. That doesn't seem like a great idea to me, but that became Friday Night Lights.
Right.
And I think, but for me, my process is what I learned from Robert Boswell. He was a big basketball fan, was how I met him. He was my mentor at New Mexico State, is just write the bad draft. Now, I don't know if this would work for you, George, because you're under pressure. The demands of a columnist are different than demands of the books that you're writing. But for me, I write a bad draft and I print it and I mark it up and I go back and I do it again. And it's through the revision that I start to understand, and it's through reading it and put it down, mark it up with reading, and I read it out loud. I read it to myself out loud, and then I find the bad sentences, the clunky sentences. But I print it and I print it and I mark it up and I do it again over. So I'm a big environmental guy. I ride a bike everywhere I go. We only have one car, and that's a Prius. I recycle everything, but I waste a lot of paper. I've wasted a lot of paper. So I write bad drafts, and I don't sit there and think until I get things perfect. Now, some people can do that, but I can't do that. And Robert Boswell said to me fairly early that I probably wasn't smart enough to write. I'm not David Foster Wallace or James Baldwin, where I don't think my brilliance shined through. But it's fortunately for me, I was such a bad basketball player. I'm the worst player in North Park College history, and I'm not exaggerating. There's no question. I was the worst one. I had 13 career points, but I think that really that prepared me, like going out and spending
More Stephen A.
spending all summer trying to make a lefty layup and spending a lot of time trying to refine my dribbling skills. That really prepared me for a writer's life. And also, I got cut from my high school team every year. And then wound up getting cut from my team as a senior. And I made my college team for 3 years and then got cut as a senior in college. And that was actually good preparation because, as you guys know, getting rejected it's just common practice. You're going to get rejected all the time as a writer. And so even to this day, I'm 65 years old, George, and it still stings when I get an editor won't write back to me or an agent won't write back to me. And it still stings. But I would say probably my only strength as a writer is that I think I've had good ideas for a book. Writing about Nolan Richardson was a good idea. The gun violence book in Chicago was a good idea. And I think I'm very lucky with Big Time that the NIL and the place of college sports is a huge deal. And as you know, the book focuses on campus protesters, 3 or 4 campus protests that go terribly wrong in a comic way. And campus protests, Gaza and Israel and the war in Gaza, all of that stuff is a huge deal on college campuses now. So the fact that I've got college campuses and college campus protests and that kind of thing, my timing has been lucky in this regard. I think with Nolan Richardson, I think if someone else came along today, he would be able to get a big name writer to write his biography. He deserved a big name writer. But I think at that time when Nolan got fired, the common narrative was he deserved to get fired. He deserved it. He deserved it. Look what he said. He's calling everybody out for racism. He ought to be fired. Mm-hmm. How can the world be racist if he's making $1 million a year? And it was, and at the same time, right around that time, if you remember, every major newspaper in America except the Boston Globe said, yes, we've got to bomb Iraq, because Iraq, was responsible for, all this false narrative about the war in Iraq. And I thought, this is when I was reading all the stuff about Nolan Richardson, about how he deserved to get fired. And I thought, there's got to be more to the story here. And it turned out there was a lot more to the story.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Russ, something I want to talk to you about, a great thing that you do is the basketball in the barrio, the program that you started in El Paso for disadvantaged youth in the Segundo Barrio and Chamizal neighborhoods. Talk about that. And I mean, it's been going for a little bit now.
Yeah, we'll be in our 33rd year. I think about Don Haskins coaching for 39 years. Well, basketball in the barrio is first. It's a summer camp. It's just for Father's Day weekend. It's a long weekend, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. But for $1, the kids in Segundo Barrio get for $1 they get a T-shirt, a basketball, a poster that has Muhammad Ali or Megan Rapinoe or that kind of thing, a harmonica, a chess set. Because we teach the kids to play chess now. And a free lunch. And so we just felt like one of the things that I was really embarrassed about is that I found this, that with our kids at UTEP is most of those kids had never gone to basketball camps because they couldn't afford it. On the varsity UTEP basketball team, many of them, this is before camps really took off, but they couldn't. So I think at a college camp, for example, at the University of Arizona camp now, I think it's $500 to go to summer camp. And I just thought, here we are in college sports making money on the backs of these kids, and they can't afford it. The neighborhoods we're targeting those kids can't afford to go to our camps. But the only thing I felt like I could really teach, I was a good teacher of dribbling skills. So I thought we targeted 6 to 10-year-old kids in the barrio. And so we get 100 kids. Can you imagine the racket? 100 kids with 100 basketballs in one gymnasium. But we mix in storytellers and music and dance, and we try to throw in an education. There's only really a third basketball, and we've had some celebrity coaches. John Carlos has been at the camp. Arnie Duncan, the U.S. Secretary of Education, came down to be a coach at the camp. Beto O'Rourke, a coach at the camp, and so we've had, of course, we've had great Greg Foster and great basketball players who've been at the camp, but. For me, I tell people I've never made a nickel from it, but I tell people it's made me rich. I mean, I really do feel like the camp really changed my life, and it made me think about, like, what is it that we're in coaching for? I would do this as a coach myself. I will confess, is that I think all coaches are like this. You put values on human beings. If George is 6'10" and he walks into my office, I drop what I'm doing and say, I got to call you back. George is here. Hang up. George, come on in. But then the short kid who's the walk-on, he comes in. I don't have time. And we're like, this is what one of the things that coaches do is we put values on human beings. And I find it really repulsive is that we've got time for the great player and we don't have time for the, for the overweight kid who just wants to talk about basketball. And I think this happens all the time in sports. And I was really pushing back against it. And the inspiration for it, Matt, I don't know, did you ever meet Rocky Galarza?
Yes.
Okay, so
I never met him. I know who he is.
Oh, he was a boxing trainer in El Paso. And George, I started going to the boxing gym every day after basketball at UTEP because I wanted to do something besides basketball. I just felt like it was just so much pressure, the college game, and I didn't want to go. I'd go to Memorial Gym, and people are arguing about the score and who fouled who. And I thought, I started going to the boxing gym, and I've been going ever since. But what I noticed about Rocky Galarza is it was an outdoor gym. And whoever came in, he treated them special. He called him champ. If you went in there today, Matt, he'd call you champ, and he would train you like you were training for the heavyweight championship of the world. And I remember once a kid coming in with one arm, and I thought, well, this will be interesting. And Rocky worked with him just like he would with anybody else. If you were a girl or you were a fat kid or you had one arm, he treated you like you were a champion. And so Rocky got killed. He was murdered. He was a victim of gun violence. And I thought, I'm going to keep his name alive. And so basketball in the barrio is actually dedicated to Rocky, but I can't teach boxing. You can see how from my nose, how my limited boxing career went. But I wanted to remember Rocky. And so the camp is always dedicated to Rocky. And the last thing I do at the end of camp, I take a basketball and go put it on his grave. It's right across from the cemetery by Chico's Tacos on in South El Paso. But I do it to remember Rocky. And people ask me why I do it, and I only do it because Rocky Galarza I worked for Don Haskins and Lou Henson, and I can honestly say that Rocky Galarza was a bigger influence on my life.
Wow.
Is there anybody that has, or any kid that has come up to you afterwards and said what kind of impact that program had on them?
Not once. But they're 9 years old. But one of the things that, like now my co-director is Elena Hernandez, and she came as a child, and then she came as a junior counselor, and then now she's a folklorico dance teacher. And I'm trying to Steve Yellen is really, that sat on the bench for the UTEP minors at one time. Steve and I have been doing the camp. So to act like it's my camp is not really accurate. Steve was the one that's raised all the money and made it financially possible. But I don't think kids at that time understand. I know for me, I didn't understand when I was working for Don Haskins what an awesome experience it would be. And I think to say to a 9-year-old, what did you get out of the camp? They'll say it was fun. They say the jump rope. I don't think kids at the time, but I think that I would like to think that kids will look back. But actually, I can't really say what the kids get out of the camp. I know what I get out of the camp. The camp really changed the way I thought about the world and thought about and El Paso has been very good to me. I was fired at UTEP. I would have never left El Paso. El Paso was good to me, but New Mexico State gave me the hero treatment and paid me. I think what I was, paid me a lot more than they probably should have. But basketball for me it was a life-changing experience.
Yeah. Good. All right,
also, I know that you're a musician too, Russ.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Well, I started, as you can tell, I'm a little off center for a coach. And about when I first came to New Mexico State, I decided to stop watching. I used to love David Letterman. And every night before bed, it was, I think, 10:30 at night. I would just sit there and watch. And I remember as a kid, I never watched. When I was a young man trying to be a basketball player, I stopped watching television. I made the decision to stop watching television. And then here I was watching television. And I just decided I need a hobby. I'm going to do something for an hour every day. And I picked the fiddle, the violin. I'd played as a boy and hated it, but then I picked it up again and it felt kind of natural. And so it's become, and the reason I went to Ireland in the first place, I coached it's the lowest level of pro basketball in the world. I went over there to coach a team, but also to learn the music. And so I'm a serious musician. I've already played today for 2 hours, and I'm a little bit. I'll admit I'm a little bit OCD, and so I try to channel it into my punctuation and editing, and channel it into my music. So music is a big part of my life, and I also think there's great similarities between the music and pickup basketball. Like with the music, you get together and you realize you understand your shortcomings, and then you go back and practice by yourself. Well, that's what happens. George will remember this. That's what happens in basketball. You realize everybody can shoot a lefty layup except me, and you go practice by yourself, and then you come back with the group. And that's actually what happens for me as a writer, is that I write it. I show it to a couple writer friends, and I realize, oh God, it's terrible. I have to go back by myself. But the idea of working by yourself and then going to the group and going back and working by yourself, that's from basketball to fiddling to writing. That's always been my looking back. I didn't know it at the time, but looking back, that's always been the process, is rely on the group. And I've had really great teachers. I've had a great writing teacher in Robert Boswell, a great fiddling teacher in Ireland named Patty Jones, and working for Don Haskins and Lou Henson. I really do think there's something to being around great, great teachers. I was very fortunate in that way that I was around great teachers, and I think my father passed away a year ago, and I had a complicated relationship with him, and I think I was always looking for older men to look up to sort of replace my dissatisfaction with my father. Was a really good person, but he's father and son stuff, maybe you guys have noticed it's complicated.
Yeah. It can be, sure. Absolutely. Yeah. Well, Russ, where can we find the book? Where can people go buy Big Time?
Well, big time. I would encourage people to go to bookshop.org. Bookshop.org, it's cheaper than Amazon, it's faster than Amazon, and bookshop.org, there's union workers, and a percentage of the money goes to independent bookstores. So I would say go to your local bookstore. If the bookstore doesn't have it, you can order it. But if you're an online person, go to bookshop.org, and it's faster. It's cheap. It's $1 cheaper at Bookshop than it is at Amazon.
Okay. Good advice.
Sounds good.
Go
Sounds
Coors
good.
State.
Absolutely.
Coors State's going to be a force to be reckoned with.
Get your popcorn ready,
you're right.
right?
Yes. Get your popcorn and go watch the Coors State. Anyway, I'm delighted to see you guys. Delighted to see you guys. And George, if you're ever in Las Cruces, if you guys get back home, it's home to you guys. If you get back.
Right.
George, before we go, did you play for Whitey Kaufman then?
No, long story short, I was supposed to go to Las Cruces High School, but I somehow decided to go to Mayfield. Yeah. I was afraid Whitey wasn't going to let me play basketball, so I went to Mayfield to make sure I could play.
And who was your coach at Mayfield then?
Clem Mancini was the football coach, and Jimmy Oliver was the basketball
Jimmy
coach.
Oliver, yeah.
Yeah, and you mentioned Lou Henson Jr., Lou's son. He played on one of the most phenomenal high school basketball teams ever, those Las Cruces high school teams back in 1975, I think it was.
Yeah.
Maybe a little bit before that, but they won back-to-back state championships. I think they maybe lost one game. They were phenomenal.
Yeah. I finally met Adam Beadle, and Adam Beadle had played. Do you remember him?
Yeah, absolutely.
He played for Nolan Richardson at the junior college, and I'd never met him.
Yeah. We played against him in grade school.
Yeah.
He's All-American.
Yeah. No, but I still follow a little bit because Will Benjamin's coaching at one of the high schools, and I see Louis Burke a couple times a week. Did you know Louis Burke?
Oh, absolutely. Played Pee Wee football with Louis.
I love Louis Burke. Like, you talk about somebody who's doing something for kids. That's where you go to the Pell Boxing Club. There's 40 kids there from 8 years old to 28, and boys and girls, and it's really amazing what he's done there.
Right,
guys like Louis that are keeping the sport of boxing alive at that level.
That's right, and he's an interesting guy. He's not a blood and guts guy. He's not screaming, and he's very level. He's closer to Lou Henson. He's not raising his voice, and everyone gets treated with respect. I love Louis.
Yeah, absolutely. Me too. One of my favorite people.
I'll tell him you said hi.
Oh, absolutely,
Please
absolutely.
I'm going.
And whether I see you in Chicago or in Las Cruces, we got to get together, Russ.
Okay, so I'm coming up. It's April 1st. I think I'm going up there and going to Purdue, but I'll be around Chicago all week. And a good friend of mine lives in Evergreen Park.
Oh, okay.
A musician friend. So I've got to go see him.
Well, I'm right here
for sure.
Okay.
All right, guys.
Russ, thank you.
Peggy's and go
Take care.